Bryson, and my friend Pat over here is Pat. Where are you? I think you're here.
I'm right here.
We are the MCs for today's event, and I just want to start off by thanking you guys all for coming. Before we start, though, I was just wondering if you guys can all make sure that you guys are muted while the speakers are talking, just so that we can minimize distractions or anything, or like random noises when the speakers are talking. But anyways, here we go. Welcome, everybody. My name is Bryson, and I'm here again with Pat as your guys' MC for this afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody and thank you guys all for joining this event today. We really appreciate you guys for virtually coming out, even though COVID-19 has kind of put us all in quite a downer for the past half year. However, we are extremely excited to be hosting our very first UNA Marin Sustainable Development Goals event. And this will be our first out of 18 bi-monthly Sustainable Development Goal events. So if you guys are interested and want to learn more about all of the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, definitely come out to our future ones. So our first SDG, which is our theme for today, is No Poverty, which aims to end poverty in all of its forms everywhere around the world. Almost half of the world lives with a household income of under $2.50 a day, and 10% makes under $1.90 a day. This is a huge issue because poverty leads to malnutrition, which attributes to 45% of all child deaths worldwide, while also preventing children from obtaining an education, and it increases rates of contracting illness, among other things. In the US, the most wealthy country in the world, almost 1 in every 6 children live in poverty. Even here in Marin County, one of the most affluent counties and in the wealthiest state in America, poverty is still a problem that exists. But how big of a problem is poverty in Marin, and how does that compare to the rest of the country and the world? And what can we do to combat poverty in our community? Well, we will find out here today. So if you guys are not familiar with the itinerary yet, we'll start off with our event with Felicia Chavez, who is our UNA Marin Chapter president, who'll give information about the UNA Marin and the SDGs. Then we'll have 2 guest speakers. Our first speaker will be Chandra Alexandre. Forgive me if I pronounce your name wrong.
Actually, Herb is our first speaker.
Oh, so Herb is our first speaker. Okay, so sorry about that. Our first speaker is actually going to be Herb Behrstock, who is a 30-year United Nations veteran who's going to teach us about the global work of the United Nations in reducing poverty. And then our second speaker will be Chandra Alexandre, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Community Action Marin, which is a nonprofit organization that helps serve people in need in our community. And then after that, we'll have a short 15-minute Q&A, and then a fun short quiz to shake it up a little bit about poverty, where the top 3 scorers will win some cool, awesome gift cards. And to finalize the event, we will have Ann Cadwell, who's our UNA Marin membership co-chair, who will close out our meeting and discuss future events. But without further ado, I'll give the floor to Felicia Chavez, our UNA Marin Chapter president.
Thank you very much, Bryson. Bryson has recently joined our board of the United Nations Association Marin County Chapter. And so just for those of you who may or may not be familiar, the United Nations Association is a national organization that is based in Washington, D.C., and has actually been around since before the United Nations itself in various forms. And that's because to create a United Nations, there needed to be a civic organization that supported the idea. And that the need for that civic organization has continued since that time. I believe it was the early 40s or something to that effect that it originally came into being. So the United Nations Association is a separate organization from the United Nations itself. We are sort of I like to call ourselves the United Nations cheerleaders, but essentially we advocate and educate for the important work of the United Nations. And that's particularly important here in the United States because though we don't often or ever see United Nations workers on the ground in our communities, nevertheless, the United States was the birthplace of the UN through the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and has been the largest financial contributor to the United Nations. And so our support, that is the citizens of the United States supporting the UN, is a very huge key piece of the whole infrastructure of the existence of the United Nations. And that's true from the beginning and continues to be through this day, though we know that we've hit some rocky territory recently. So today's focus is on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 1, no poverty. And I am going to share my screen briefly, just so that you get a sense of this little website that the caveat for this is the URL is sdgmarin.org. And you can find a link to it from unamarin.org. And I just wanted to bring this up so we have a visual of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So today we're talking about this one, number 1, no poverty. And I'm going to click on it. Not all of these are clickable, but today this one is. And the full text of that goal is end poverty in all its forms everywhere. So for those of you who are not familiar, this whole set of the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals were published in 2015. And they came out of what's called a United Nations consultation process. And that means that the United Nations carried out probably the biggest, I would call it like organizational development or systems thinking type consultation across the globe. All 193 countries of the United Nations participated in some way in the creation of these 17 global goals. And some of you might have heard of the Millennium Development Goals. There were 8 of those, and they came before this set of goals. And they made enough progress on the Millennium Development Goals, though those were aimed primarily at developing countries, that they decided to work on a larger set of goals for the whole planet, for all countries. And that's when they spent a couple of years pulling these together, and it came out as the 17 goals. Some of you may already know this, but I'll just mention it quickly, that we've added an 18th goal, arts, culture, and community. And that's our little nod to making things local and relevant to the local scene. And let's see, so I wanted to just point out that this draft website, SDG Marin, the idea is something like, if you live in Marin County and you would like to know about the status of people living in poverty in Marin County, how do you know? Well, right now you have to do a lot of research. You either have to know somebody like Chandra, who's going to be able to point you in the right direction, or you have to figure out how to do a lot of very thoughtful Googling to come up with statistics. So the idea is something like, with the help of this grid of the SDGs, we can ask those questions about how our community is doing. And wouldn't it be great if we had a place we could go where we could immediately access all of this great work that's already been done on looking at, for example, as our subject is today, poverty in Marin County. So here I've just put together some very initial, like me doing a Google search and talking to some people and referencing my notes, resources for understanding more about the picture of poverty in Marin County. So for example, under videos, I have this Making Ends Meet in Marin 2020. So this was a talk that was done recently in Marin County about how difficult it is to afford to live here. And that's the only video I put in there. But if somebody else has additional resources as we go through right now or later, you're welcome to post those in the chat. That would be very helpful. A couple of reports, Snapshot of Poverty, Marin County, United Way, Bay Area, 2017. And then this is an article, here's how many Marin County kids live in poverty. And that's just one I found on Patch from 2019. A couple of databases. And then I don't think I actually have any books in here. And then the idea would be like, hey, there's the global targets. Oops, that needs to be updated. But the idea would be we need local targets for #1, no poverty in Marin County. So I'm going to leave it there for the moment. This is a much bigger conversation than we have time to cover entirely today, but I'm really glad we have our two speakers to help us get both the big picture from Herb and then the very important local picture from Chandra. Is there anything I forgot, RMCs, that I was supposed to talk about?
No, you're good.
Covered it for the most
Okay,
part.
great.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
All right. So for our first speaker for today's event is the president of the United Nations Association, Northern California Division, with a 30 years career in the United Nations. He was also a senior officer in the African and Asian departments and the coordinator of UN operations and representative of the UN Development Program in New York. Now he is here to talk about the global work of the UN in reducing poverty. Herb Behrstock, everybody.
Well, thank you very much, guys, and everybody. I really genuinely appreciate the invitation to share this event with another speaker, Chandra, who's going to focus on the local. Hopefully we can bring a nice package together for you and have a discussion. I want to compliment your chapter for taking the initiative to focus on all 17 SDGs and to invite others. And it's great that you have multi-generations on there. So let me begin by trying to open this.
Oh, and Herb, Felicia.
Yeah.
So Felicia will give you a 3 minutes warning before your time is up via private chat. Thank you.
Okay, I might need that. I was warned many times this morning by someone who's on the call that we got to stick on target. So here's what we're going to talk about. And it's end poverty in all its forms everywhere. 3 different concepts. And I want to break it down, go through what it means, how these SDGs came about in a little more detailed depth than Felicia's really good introduction, because she set the stage, and then look at some indicators of what's happening globally and end up with what we can do. And I think that probably will be a nice supplement for what you'll hear in the second statement. So here's what it is. What's the role of the UN in all this? And does it really matter if the UN wasn't there to do it? Would there ever be some kind of a SDGs or these kind of commitments? And then what does it mean here in Marin, California, and what does it mean in other countries? And that requires some explanation because we have very few people in Marin living below $2 a day in income, but we have poverty in Marin and California in the United States. Third, the status of this, this SDG. Fourthly, I was asked to elaborate a little bit on how the SDGs, this one in particular, is being monitored and pursued globally, and then the what can we do stuff. So I wanted to start with something that goes back, and Felicia mentioned the history, to the 1943 or so, when the US had its representatives of the UN Association lobbying for the US to stay in the to get in and stay in the United Nations once it was created. In 1948, there was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And one of those rights is really important because going back even to the 1940s, we see that there was a foundation which kind of led the way to seeing what would become the SDGs. This is really, most people don't know that the detail was there. Every person has a right to a standard of living for their health and their well-being, to food and clothing and housing and medical care, to the access to social services and the right to security in their lives. In a way, some of the stuff that Bryson even mentioned at the outset, you know, this is, the SDGs are interrelated. And even back in 1948, when Eleanor Roosevelt led the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that were adopted by all countries, they said, hey, this is something that is a responsibility of every government to promote and to help achieve. So right there, I hope everybody can see it's taken, since 1948 to the Millennium Goals and the SDGs to say, okay, if that's the goal, if that's the aspiration of all governments, what are we going to do? Okay, so here's what has happened before the SDGs were created and when they were. In 1945, when the UN was created, 50% of the global population lived on less than $1 a day. That was considered as kind of a standard of what defined absolute poverty. Think of it, $365 a year. In real terms, money you could get by selling your goods in the market or working on a farm or whatever it was, or its equivalent. Maybe you didn't even get cash income, but you had those means, so you didn't have to go out and buy your bread. You could grind your own maize or rice or something. By 1990, 36% of the global population was living on less than $1 a day. So after the war, and with efforts to try to deal with the problem, already poverty had dropped, absolute poverty had dropped. By 2015, that was the end of the 15 years of the Millennium Development Goals. In the year 2000, all the member states adopted these Millennium Development Goals. And the #1 goal at the time was end poverty. Was to reduce poverty by 50% in the aggregate around the world. And by 2015, that target had actually been fulfilled. Now, that doesn't mean there were not inequities. Much of the success was because of India and China that made a big effort and had momentum for growth. And they reduced by hundreds of millions of people the group that was vulnerable and in absolute poverty. There was improvement in every region of the world. And therefore, in aggregate terms in the world, this target was met. Now, that's really, really significant because in 2000, the MDGs were the first time in human history that all the governments in the world had ever said, we know what we want, we're going to set quantifiable, monitorable targets and a date, and they're all achievable. So that's really significant. Okay, the SDGs that were adopted, as Felicia said, in 2015, set a target, the global agenda for 2030. And we were coming along, making progress. After 4 years, poverty had been reduced to 8.2%, about 600 million people. And you notice that the level of absolute poverty had been increased by the World Bank and others to say, okay, let's adjust for inflation and whatever else. So it was $1.90 per day. The projection for this year was that poverty would drop to 7.7. But now the projection conservatively is that poverty will go up. No surprise there because of the virus. And I say, that's my word, conservatively, because these estimates are constantly being revised. The pandemic is not going away. You probably know besides there are 3 poor countries in the world that are doing the worst: India, Brazil, and the United States. Pause, contemplate, think about that. And so the numbers who are entering into poverty has gone up. The estimate was 71 million. It's in the UN reports. There's a report on all the SDGs that was published a few weeks ago in advance of the General Assembly meeting that will address the SDGs and their status in September, later this month, when the General Assembly opens. So there is a return of people to absolute poverty. This is a tragic reversal of the way things were developing and the commitment to end poverty. Even last year, there was a projection that absolute poverty would not be totally eliminated by the target date of 2030 in the SDG 1. They still estimated, the experts estimated that 6% would still be in absolute poverty. And the reason is because, like in many things, you know, the first steps are the easiest, and as you get closer and closer to the end, like eliminating polio, or how we're eventually going to eliminate COVID, you know, the last ones are going to be the hardest to get. So they projected at least 6% was expected by 2030. But now, because of the COVID crisis and the climate crisis, there are some estimates from a number of different sources saying that 1 billion people could be in poverty compared to the 590 million in 2019, just last year. And the potential of food insecure people who don't know if they've got enough to get through, it's in some estimates going to go up to 2 billion people, which of course would throw people into poverty and inability to maybe even get jobs. Okay, so this is a sign of success of global resolution and intentionality, and it's a sign of our crisis and what we're facing now. Okay, now I mentioned in all forms because even I thought, okay, the goal is to end absolute poverty by 2030. That is one of the 7 targets of SDG number 1. So we already saw just a moment ago the struggle to attain that target. Every one of the 17 SDGs, and maybe even the 18th if Felicia makes them up, is going to have some targets that will be measurable by 2030. And we, the world, can track how fast, how well, how geographically distributed the progress is being made, or there are problems. The second part of this poverty in all forms is something that's very interesting. It's in a way like the MDG. It says we're not going to get rid of all poverty in all forms in all nations, but poverty, the goal is to reduce it by 50% in every country. So the United States is a good example, or Marin, doesn't have to worry really about ending absolute poverty by 2030. You're just probably not going to have any people who are living below $1.90 a day in 2030. But Marin and California in the United States and every other country should say, okay, under our circumstances, we need to look at the bottom half or the bottom quintile or the most poor and vulnerable and say, what are we going to do about those, and how can we reduce their suffering, their poverty, in, as we might define it, by 50%. So you see, these are very different things. Another one of the targets that governments all agreed on was to ensure social protection for all. They use those words, but basically that, and it's related to some of the other ones here. Basically, it means that governments have a responsibility to implement programs that will protect the poor and most vulnerable, like unemployment insurance and access to health care if you don't have it, you know, national or some other form of health care, maternity leave, if you can no longer generate income, those kind of things. Next, to acknowledge the rights of all. Now, I mentioned they don't mention it in the SDG, but going back to even the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, it's to say every country needs to acknowledge these rights by 2030 and ensure access of all people, poor and most vulnerable, to the services and the support so that they have an opportunity to achieve the goals of SDG 1. Next, build resiliency of the poor and vulnerable to these externalities. Climate change. Is your screen also showing everybody's gallery photo? Is that shared and I'm blocking my own slides?
Herb, while the screen is being shared, people can see and they can toggle between their own views on their own computers or devices.
Okay.
They have control over that, yeah.
Okay. Maybe I can get rid of my own. There we go. Okay. So these externalities are important because clearly, you know, you can be escaping poverty and all of a sudden a cyclone or a tornado or a flood or a whole bunch of forest fires come, and there are going to be maybe wealthy people or people who are not in poverty, but especially the poor and vulnerable. So there has to be a commitment that every country will have in place some kind of programs to ensure resilience. And then for the countries that are the poorest, there has to be some way to mobilize global resources to support them. They don't necessarily have the means, just like they don't have the means right now to combat COVID if it's really hitting us hard. The world needs to work together through, to a large extent, or as much as possible, the United Nations to help those countries. And then the last one is that despite the, or in addition to the international collaboration, there's a focus on each country. Our country, the United States, as well as internationally, has to look at equity and pro-poor policies to protect the most vulnerable people. So that means, you know, what is Washington going to do to reverse some of these problems, and going back to the different dimensions of absolute poverty. Okay. Let me pause in case somebody wants to interject something now. I want to keep going because time is getting short too. Or can I just keep going? I'll keep going. Okay. Let me give you some personal experiences. I worked, in addition to what was mentioned in headquarters, I worked in 8 different countries for 6 months to 3 years. And the question is, you know, what has the United Nations done? What can we as UNA members be proud of, and, you know, include in the aggregate in our elevator speeches why the United Nations deserves support? When I was in Swaziland, my first post starting in 1992 for 3 years, we were working on projects to improve agricultural income, to introduce plowing not by a hoe, but with an animal, to increase the yield and income of farmers. There was a program to start small businesses. There was a literacy program with the help of UNESCO. In Haiti, where I worked for 3 years, there were projects to work on plant and crop production and yields, cash crops. There were programs on conservation to protect the potential income now and in the future for people. There was also programs to promote small business. That was in the 1970s. In China, when I worked there in the 1980s, believe it or not, China asked for support from the United Nations to improve their production of fruits and vegetables. You know, they've been doing this for years, feeding 1 billion people, and they said, we need to catch up with the best technology and know-how that the world has got to feed our own people who are living at poverty levels, to help them escape. And China, as I mentioned, was one of the most successful. In fact, they made their biggest spurt in alleviating poverty just in those years after I was there. But they asked for help from the United Nations to improve how vegetables could be grown and preserved and grow with seed varieties in slightly colder climates, so that the people in the northern parts of the country, for example, would have food during the winter. They wouldn't lose their the benefits of nutrition, and they wouldn't get ill as much. There were also lots of efforts to transfer technology that they requested to create jobs, because they were obviously still using out-of-date technology. They were a closed country for so long. And we helped the Chinese government set up a social security system related to one of the SDGs. When I was in Kazakhstan for 3 years, one of the big problems in a whole section of the country is that the country had been the victims of Soviet nuclear testing. And there was a whole big geographic area that was living in poverty, and people had all kinds of cancers and health problems and all sorts of problems. And I personally got involved in that, helped the UN General Assembly, supported Kazakhstan on 3 resolutions, long story. We helped on gender equality to make sure women could get access to income and jobs and security and their rights. We launched the first HIV/AIDS campaign because it was just coming into Kazakhstan, and that would have decimated another part of the population. So you get a global health there. In Angola, where I was, there was a massive program because the country had been involved in a civil war that displaced, I forget what it was, close to 50% of the population. And they were just living on handouts. The United Nations was providing a tremendous support of food, health services, some education for relief. And one of the efforts was to say, okay, we need to transition so that they could develop and have skills so that they could come out of this crisis. And then finally in Bhutan, what a joy. Some of you have heard the phrase, the gross national happiness, not gross national product. This is due to the enlightenment of the monarchy and the king, and that is to support the people locally. We had all kinds of different programs to empower those people, to train them so they could use their own resources and skills at their different localities and regions. So these are some examples of what I witnessed, what I saw, that helped to give me this enthusiasm for what the United Nations can do, which is carried over for my interest in the UN Association as cheerleaders, quote unquote, thank you, Felicia, as cheerleaders for the UN, and I've been involved in UNA for a long time. Okay, I'm nearing end. Okay, so what can we do about poverty? I think we're going to hear more about that for Marin as well, near us and globally. Okay, these are some of the...
Sorry, Herb, just wanted to interrupt. And have you been seeing my timekeeping chats?
No, I haven't. I don't have any chats.
Okay, well, we have, we built in about a 5-minute sort of padding time. So technically, let's say if you could wrap up in the next 2 minutes, then we'll be safe.
Okay, great. I think I can do that.
Great.
Actually, the chat is not showing because my screen is full of a shared screen. Okay, so mobilize awareness and support. If people don't care and then connect it to SDG 1, they're not going to be very much involved in it. So we've got to do something about that. We need to recognize the role of the UN. If we care about the problem of poverty, the UN plays a role. Thirdly, we've got to advocate for the American leadership, again, like it used to be on health and poverty eradication, to support the SDGs, funding, and to support the programs that are pulling out of them. That's a big topic that UNA is involved in all the time. The next one is not just to support it, but raise the ambition to have people say, okay, not is poverty a problem, but we've got to eradicate absolute. We got to do those other dimensions of poverty alleviation. And then because there are some solutions and some improvements that have been made in the United States, in Marin and around the world, we got to build on those that are ongoing, or now because of the decline, because of the virus and climate change, we have to face new challenges. And the Secretary General has said, in effect, we got to have a whole new start, or restart, or reconsideration of the SDGs given the slippage. Then sixth is get involved in advocacy. And there's all kinds of issues that are coming up in California, in the US, about jobs with a living wage, changing the crazy tax policy that we have that skews against the poor and gives so much benefit to the wealthier people, social protection programs, including health and safety net programs. And of course, last, climate change, as we know, this week and always is affecting the most poor and vulnerable as well as the general population. And there should be some efforts to have what's called environmental justice. Some of you, many of you have heard of that, but it means focus on those who are most vulnerable and be sure that solutions and subsidies and incentives and whatever it is are aimed to help those who are poorest. So that's what I had in mind, and ding, thank you very much. I look forward to the Q&A.
All right, thank you, Herb. And let's, everyone, let's unmute ourselves and just give her a round of applause.
Excellent.
Excellent.
Thank
Well
you.
done.
Bravo. Yes, yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so our next speaker for today is Chief Executive Officer at Community Action Marin. She is a seasoned nonprofit executive and fund development professional with 20 years of experience supporting organizations to social justice outcomes. Her work has helped strengthen regional affordable housing and early childhood education initiatives and many more. And so this is Chandra Alexandre, everybody.
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you. It's nice to see your faces and to see your waving. Felicia, thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this conversation. And I want to tell you that I am an official UN mentor as well. So I feel part of a family here, and that's through the San Francisco chapter. I currently reside in San Francisco, and come October, I will be a Marin resident. So I'm really happy and excited about that. So yeah, it's wonderful. So let me just tell you a little bit. I'm going to give you some context before I dive into the landscape of Marin, but I want to give you some context for my organization. Community Action Marin is part of a national network of community action agencies. If you have not heard of Community Action, don't worry, I hadn't before I came to Community Action Marin, but it's an important resource and a very important network, I think, for you to know about. So I want to introduce you both locally and to the national work of community action. As agencies, community action agencies are committed to alleviating the causes and the consequences of poverty. So we sit or stand squarely in values aligned with SDG #1, no poverty. And I will start by saying that when we think about the possibilities for the eradication of poverty by 2030, I am optimistically inclined in the locality of Marin County to say that yes, this is possible. This is something that we can do, and I'll talk a lot in this presentation about how I think we can achieve SDG #1 on a local scale, and in fact become a proof point for what's possible around this sustainable development goal nationally. We have the resources to make that happen. So community action, again, born out of really two commitments and two moments in US history. One is the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. The other is the Civil Rights Act. And so our twin strands of DNA are firmly rooted in economic and racial justice. And in the context and landscape of Marin County, this is incredibly important because you may know that Marin County is the least equitable by race across many indicators of health, really all indicators of health, education, well-being, housing, income. The people who are poor in Marin, approximately 20,000 people, roughly 8% of our population in Marin County. The people who are poor in our county are by and large people of color. We have a population in the county that is about 70% white. And we know particularly during this time of COVID-19, the pandemic, we see the disparate impacts of the pandemic on people living in our county and the ways in which even for the people who are testing positive for COVID because of the disproportionate impacts of poverty. We know, for example, that in a population, again, where there's about 70% people who are white, we've got about 15% Latino folks in our community. Of the people who are testing positive during this pandemic, we have approximately 86% of them are coming from our Latino community. So we know that there are intersections in this moment that are particularly important for us to be paying attention to, and they are important across lines of race and for people who are most experiencing what it means to be living at or below the federal poverty line. And so when we're talking about these numbers in Marin, about 20,000 people who are living at or below the federal poverty line, we're talking about, for a family of 4, 2 children, 2 adults, an income of $26,000 a year. And what we know in the Bay Area and in Marin County is that what's required to live, we speak of a living wage here, what's required is about $125,000 a year. And yet we have people who are living at the poverty line, making $26,000 a year, again, for a family of 4. So you can imagine that overcrowding situations where people, again, thinking about the impacts of COVID-19, the disproportionate racial impacts, where people who are living with multiple families in smaller dwellings, and the increased probabilities for people who are low-wage workers, it's clear to see that we have a challenge, we have a problem. So in the county, that translates to about 1/3 of people who are living paycheck to paycheck if they're employed and they have access to resources through employment right now. But that means often that people are getting to the end of the month and they're having to make a decision between putting food on the table or paying their rent. What my agency is committed to doing, we are the largest nonprofit social services agency in Marin County, and our commitment is to help ensure that we provide a safety net of services in this time. It's particularly focused on keeping people housed and providing people with cash assistance to meet their immediate needs beyond paying rent and keeping a roof over their heads. So that can often look like paying medical bills or paying for transportation expense. To transition from living in a car to putting a down payment on a Section 8 housing voucher. And really ensuring that from safety net into stabilization services, people have the ability to create pathways to thriving. And that's what we do locally at Community Action Marin, and that's what Community Action as a network is committed to. The face of poverty, again, is largely in Marin County, the face of people of color. And we have, I think, at this time, a heightened awareness, not simply because of the pandemic, but because of what we've seen across the nation and, in fact, across the globe, given the incredible response to police brutality, specifically focused in the Black community here, and here meaning in the US, and the ways in which people are rising up against racial injustice. And the important focus that we have now on an ability to make a different choice and to recreate systems and structures that will work for all of us who live in this country, to recreate pathways to the American dream, and to, for Marin County, start to look at opportunities for change that can truly help and benefit all of us. So that's the work that we do. Again, those twin strands I mentioned of Community Action Marin's DNA, focused in the Economic Opportunity Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We as an agency were founded in 1966, so we've been working at this in the county for over 50 years, but weaving those together at a time where we have the possibility, both because our eyes are more opened, I think, nationally and in our county to racial injustice, and because we have access to money and resources. So we have the potential to do something in response to this moment and take a look at what our collective power can help to shift. So much like Herb said, there are many pathways to examine as we explore how to take next steps. I think the first, I'm going to give you 4. I think the first step that we need to take is a look at our own personal position and our own personal relationship to the privilege that we carry, the ability that we have to make choices if we're not living paycheck to paycheck, thinking about the resources that we have and doing some self-reflection on what values we stand for and who we are as individuals committed to making a county that is that creates possibilities for thriving for all of us. And in this, I would say that step number 1 for me has been to deepen my commitment to trusting people. Part of what we've learned as an agency, working in collaboration with other community-based organizations and government private funders as well in the county, is that trusting people leads to incredible change. It really leads to change for families, for households, for the better. And one example of that is providing cash assistance. And it's a shift in mindset for many people who potentially grew up thinking about the stereotypical welfare queen, or thinking about people who were getting public assistance as people who just didn't work hard enough or who were lazy. And we have to do some self-exploration to shift how we might be thinking about people who really need those public benefits and services. And what we know is that there's a growing evidence base, even in our own backyard here in the county, around the import of cash grants to people who need it. And in this pandemic time, we've seen incredible results for getting resources to individuals and families to make dramatic shifts for them to meet urgent needs. It's been very, very powerful. So trusting people, I think, is the number 1 way that we can get to the alleviation of poverty in our county, in our midst by 2030. The second is really by partnering well. thinking about the resources that we have through other organizations, through more people coming to the table, the kinds of representation that we have from different communities who are accessing seats at the table, not going it alone, and really thinking about how do we collaborate with one another for potential resources. So for example, the work that Marin Community Foundation in partnership with county government has done to provide rental assistance has been transformational for so many. And yet we know that if the collaborations among community-based organizations, Community Action Marin and Canal Alliance and West Marin Community Services and Women Helping All People in Marin City and so many other partners, if we hadn't collaborated to make that rental assistance get to the people of greatest need, we wouldn't see the kinds of hopefulness that we're now seeing among our communities of low income and our communities of color. And that's not to say that we've eradicated the problem. We certainly haven't. We know that there continue to be people who are incredibly impacted by the pandemic. But it means that we've been able to create gratitude and moments of inspired connection to people willing to help other people. And it's through those collaborations across the county and being willing to say that given the resources we have, we can do a fantastic job. We can do a better job of meeting people where they are in the most crisis or the greatest crisis to help create those changes for them and for their families. I think the other thing is that when we think about the kinds of decision-making opportunities we have to partner well, I mentioned creating more seats at the table and using a racial and economic lens, justice-focused lens to do that. We have to think about the people who are the consumers, the people who are the clients, the people who are of low wage, the people who are of color, the youth in our communities, people who are working grassroots leaders for change, to create opportunities to bring them into the conversation and into the dialogue. So that's number two. One is really to trust people. Two is to partner well, and I've given some examples of that. The third is to use data and data sharing agreements as part of those collaborations. Data can help us open our eyes to different kinds of realities. I know that when the Race Counts report came out in the end of 2017 and people were looking at the data into 2018 and beyond, and we recognized Marin as this incredibly affluent place with tremendous possibility and potential that was truly leaving an incredible number of people behind, that we had for example, an individual living in Ross, living 15 years longer on average than an individual who's born and raised in Marin City. And we said, that's not okay. That's not the kind of Marin that we want. And we started to embrace that. The use of data can be transformational in enabling mindset shifts to create better outcomes for all of us. So using data, ensuring that we're collaborating, that we're sharing data, that we're thinking about how to make decisions, given everything I've said already about looking at ourselves and how we're thinking about whether or not we're trusting our community members, partnering well and bringing all voices to the table, bringing more voices to the table, certainly, and using data to help inform our strategy and our decision-making is going to be critically important to being able to achieve our goal of alleviating poverty, the causes and the conditions of poverty by 2030. And then the final one, and Herb touched on this as well, is really becoming advocates and champions and being willing to stand up in our community for what we want to see and how we want to see change, and then to work actively to change laws and policies to create different kinds of outcomes, access to new opportunities, to implementing laws that help to move people into opportunities and gain access. So there are two things that are immediately on the table. One is that if we haven't already, we can, by the end of this month, ensure that we're participating and being counted in the census. We know that the census is a key civic action that we can take to ensure that we're counted, because money and resources come to our county if we're counted, and ensuring that we're getting our neighbors to be counted, that we're not leaving children 0 to 5 uncounted, that we're getting to everyone in the county to ensure that not just the money and resources, but the political power, the representation stays in California through the census. The other, of course, is that we can vote. We can learn more about our local candidates and get involved and stand again behind the values that we hold dear and that we want to see for change if our commitment is truly to no poverty in Marin County. How do we leverage the resources and affluence of our county in order to be able to do that? We can certainly run for office ourselves, so that's a possibility. And if we're not up for running for office, then we can certainly find a community-based organization and serve on a board. One of the key ways that I see is increasing public and private partnerships and collaborations with government and ensuring that our voice is heard in part by stepping up and taking on these volunteer positions to serve on boards of directors and be part of the movement for change. So all of this together can really help us reach sustainable goal number 1, no poverty by 2030. And I do believe, as I said at the outset, that Marin County has an incredible opportunity to be a leader in this area and really make a great difference toward making that possible. We can be a proof point for what's possible in our country. So thanks.
Great, thank you. I just want to pipe in really quickly that we still have 4 minutes left.
Yep, I'm just reading, there's a comment on the side that says this is more important this year than ever. So anything that everyone on this call can do to ensure that people are counted in their community, the better. So I'll take questions. I'm happy to take questions unless we want to just end early and open it up to questions for myself and for Herb.
Take some applause. Bravo, thank you.
I'll take some applause.
Yeah.
We seem to be missing Pat. Oh, there you are, Pat.
Yeah, my computer is a little bit laggy right now, so I'm just a little bit behind.
So Pat, Chandra just wrapped up her presentation and Dirk just suggested applause. So I'll let you MC that if your computer's working now.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So sorry about that. Yeah, so just thank you for, so let's just give her another round of applause. Sorry about that.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
And now I think we are moving on to Q&A, right, Felicia?
That looks right. Okay, so let's see. We want to check the chat and see if there were some questions. So there's 3 ways to ask questions. One is to post your question in the chat. Well, you may have already done that, so maybe there's just 2 ways. And the second would be to either wave your hand so we can see you on the screen or raise your hand under the participants setting in Zoom, and we will get to you. And so we're going to take questions both for Herb and for Chandra. And let me just check if there were any questions posted in the chat before we move to waved hands. It looks like Herb had mentioned Measure for America. And yes, we had done one of those in Marin that was published in 2012, I believe. And yeah, interesting to break down by quintile. And yes, thanks for that, Herb. So Herb provided a URL in the chat to Measure of America if anybody's interested in checking that out. And so Frank, I believe you had waved your hand.
Yeah. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. Okay. I think there are 2 main issues here. As far as improving the lot of Hispanics, I can't talk about Marin City, but I have a lot of experience with the canal because I was an ESL aide teacher at San Rafael High School for quite a few years and had a lot of contacts with the Hispanic community as a result. I think there are 2 very important aspects here. If we're going to help the Hispanic community economically and help them to help themselves, one is improving language and the other is raising the level of education. I dealt with Hispanic students in ESL classes for many years, and they would do fairly well. They'd go home to very crowded conditions. And that's another thing I think we should talk about sometime is housing. I don't have much familiarity with the housing issue, but the canal area is very overcrowded. And as some of you may have noticed, there is a much, much higher rate of COVID-19 infection in the canal community than the rest of Marin County, simply because of that overcrowdedness. So that's another thing that one has to be concerned about. But housing is something I know very little about, but greater low-cost housing around Marin County would be very welcome. Education, language, let's talk about language. These kids would do fairly well in their lessons. They'd go home and they'd be stuck in close quarters with adults, primarily adults who had the Spanish language television turned on, were speaking to each other in Spanish, and they couldn't progress with their English as a result. So we've got to somehow overcome that and provide a lot of language education for people who are now in the working class, in the workforce, so they can not only speak English with their kids, often enough their kids were their liaison with the rest of the community. They're interpreters. And that's a difficult situation to overcome.
And so, Frank, were you just wanting to make that statement, or were you hoping for a response from one of our speakers?
A response, but...
okay, I'm going to cut you off there because we want to make sure to get to other people's questions.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, I have a quick point to make. I definitely hear you. There are some challenges that you've well articulated there, Frank. One of the challenges we have in Marin is that we have an incredibly low number of educators in the K-12 system who are educators of color. We do not have educators who are in the system. We cannot seem to retain educators of color. And when children, this is part of what we know about what works for the community that you're addressing here, Frank. What we know that works is when children see themselves represented in their teachers who have male teachers of color, where they have female teachers of color, where they have people who look like them, who understand them, who bring a trauma-informed lens and a culturally sensitive lens into an educational environment, they do well. They feel supported. And in Marin, we have a paucity of educators of color. So it's
the best ESL teacher I worked with was a white woman who was beloved by her Hispanic students. So I don't necessarily go along with you about that. But anyway.
Okay, thank you. So I saw another hand raised. David Campbell?
Yes, thank you, Felicia. Good program. Thank you, Herb and Chandra. Herb, I'm looking at slide 4, I believe it is, status trends of success and crisis. And it looks like the standard somewhere between 1990 and 2015 went from $1 a day to $1.90 a day. Can you speak to that transition and that new standard? And are there other critical dollar value thresholds that would be interesting to look at? Maybe it's $10, $5 a day, or $10 a day, just those two related questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, David. Occasionally, there have to be adjustments in those kind of calculations. What constitutes poverty? For example, a loaf of bread used to cost 8 cents, and now it's a couple bucks. So what kind of income people need in order to combat poverty, overcome their deprivations and vulnerabilities has gone up. So this is, I'm not sure how the World Bank or the Bank and the IMF do it, but they're looked to for doing that kind of number crunching. And they felt that just to say that absolute poverty was $1 a day didn't adequately address the issue. It's like we have adjustments for a lot of other costs, and what the income is now compared to what it was, or what the cost of a car was to what it is now. Prices have changed. Is that okay?
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
And Troy?
Yeah, I found myself several months ago watching how much money was being spent on the response to COVID. And I thought, where is the money going to come from? And this problem is not just the United States, it's the rest of the world. So I wrote a letter to the editor. I don't know if anybody published it, but I proposed that the world governments get together and agree to cut their defense spending in half and all make contributions to the United Nations so that the United Nations peacekeeping forces could intervene in countries with warfare rather than the United States, for example, feeling the need to do it, which certainly isn't our place in my opinion. And, you know, then other money that would be saved could go for education, healthcare, housing, transportation, infrastructure, dealing with climate change. And this idea keeps growing in my head, and people talk about defunding the police. I would like to defund the Pentagon. I just wonder how we can get this ball rolling so that it becomes a grassroots movement, something that everybody gets behind.
Herb or Chandra, any responses?
Yeah, I think that's a super proposal. Some of you know that there have been these global consultations that the UN invited this 75th anniversary year from people all over the world about what kind of a world we want. Some of you might have participated in that. What would be the steps to get there, what government should do, what the UN should do, what we can do in our communities, what UNA can do. And one of the consistent recommendations, Anne, was that we're all screwed up about how policies, how financial policies are being determined by governments, that so much money is going to the military, that could be hopefully be smarter. And that was the feedback from all over the world, and certainly from American consultations about how to get to a better world. There were consultations in all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. It was quite an undertaking. The United Nations asked UNA to conduct those consultations. So you're on target. So now we need to support our members of Congress and lobby hard so they hear our voices that some of this money's got to be shifted through monetary policy and budgeting, not just through fiscal policy and how taxes are imposed or credits and stimuli are given.
Thank you, Herb. Thank you, Anne. So I see another hand raised and number ending in 1405. Is that you, Dirk? Oh, you just muted yourself, Dirk. Oh, now you unmuted yourself.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think to put in stark contrast economic injustice, we should note that the bottom rung of upper class, 380,000, has grown by some magnificent percentage, while the percentage of people living in poverty has diminished by some specific percentage, both in Marin and locally and nationally.
Thanks for that. Herb or Chandra, any comments on Dirk's comments?
Chandra?
No, I don't know the percentage or what that specifically means relative to population. So I don't have anything to offer, but it's an interesting point. Would love to know more about that.
Let me jump in. It's not directly related to Dirk's question, but maybe sheds light on it. And it gets back somewhat to what Frank said. SDG 1 is not standing alone. I mean, as Frank said, and I think Dirk suggests and others do, is that, you know, poverty is linked to education, climate to health, jobs to consumption and production. So we need to tackle these things kind of holistically, even though we have specific goals and specific targets. And when we look at California or Marin or the United States, I mean, there's a whole package of things we need to work on, and calls for good assessments and lots of lobbying.
Great, thanks for that. So I don't see any more hands raised. I just wanted to open it up just because we have a few minutes here for the Q&A that we've allotted. And certainly if you have any questions that come up, raise your hand. But also just to invite the participants to share any experiences you've had. If you're willing to share experiences you've had either as a wealthy person, and a middle income person, a person living in poverty. I can just say that for myself, I grew up in Northern California in a very small town. And so I experienced food stamps as a little kid. I experienced living technically, I'm sure, below the poverty line. And so I've been on, different sides of the fence when it comes to income, having family members sort of all across the income spectrum. And it's a very unique set of challenges. I hear a lot of people talking about how climate change is the most urgent issue that we're facing. And while I personally agree with that, I also understand that when you're challenged with just meeting your food needs every day, climate change is not your uppermost issue. So it's a very complex web of interrelated challenges that we're all dealing with. And Chandra, in particular, I really liked your point about trusting people, because I feel like that's we're lacking in that. And I sort of flashed to the whole, earned in, a universal basic income, and, those types of questions. And the fact that, Chandra, I think, yeah, I believe I might have initially met you actually through the Leo training. And I remember our speaker there, Monica Sharma, who is originally from India, saying that in India, people believe that if you are in poverty, you have bad karma. And in the United States, people believe that if you are in poverty, you are somehow lazy. And so there's these, it was just to me a really striking example of our belief systems that we carry around with ourselves and in relationship to poverty and lack. So do we have any other questions, comments, general reflections from the audience before we move to our quiz?
I guess I have one question that I just thought of. So I guess in terms of like current events and, with the whole election going on and the COVID crisis, I was wondering what you guys think about policies from both sides, like the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, where on combating poverty, and how like the Democrats are like pro like higher tax rates in order to be able to fund like better education for people in low income households or people who are living in poverty, whereas the Republican Party, I guess, is they're reducing tax rates in order to benefit businesses, which they say would decrease unemployment and increase wages. What do you guys think about these policies, and do you guys have a certain opinion on which is better or which does not work? Sorry, that question's a little bit confusing, but
I'm gonna start by saying that my position is one that is really about, or underscoring a point that I made earlier. This has got to be a joint solution set, right? This has got to be, and we've got to stop with the partisan politics around things like poverty or the SDGs. And we have got to have ways to shake hands across the political aisle in order to do the right thing according to human dignity and human respect. And part of what's so laborious in our country right now for me and for so many others is that there are many who refuse. And I think the problem is that we continue to see the deleterious impacts of policies that don't work or haven't been well thought out or haven't fully, to one of my other points, brought the people who are the most impacted by policies to the table in conversation to provide informed perspective and opinion. And if we lack insight from the diversity of who we are as a country, we can't possibly create policies that work. And so I would challenge us to really think about, if we can, I talked about values, and I think about, and I talked about thinking about, how we find our own personal values in order to take a stand then politically and in our lives. If we can do that in a way that says human dignity is actually paramount, that community family is actually paramount, that ensuring that we're thinking about food, clothing. I mean, Herb's slide, you know, it said Herb 46, you know, food, shelter, clothing, human dignity, human rights. If we can put that at the center of the conversation and not ask polarizing questions, I think we have a better chance of coming up with a solution set. So forgive me, that's not exactly the answer, you know, to your immediate question, but community action stands for, again, what's right for the people that we serve. We don't ask, what side of the political aisle are you on? We don't ask what's your CEO or executive director's politics. We ask about, are you committed to racial and economic justice for all people? Are you committed to alleviating poverty for all people? Are you committed to different kinds of thinking to get to solutions? So my hope is that stands very much in alignment with why all of you are committed to the UN Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals, why you're part of this conversation. And I would love to have us be more risk-taking in our willingness to further an agenda that says the inherent dignity of each person is paramount. And if we can open up dialogue and conversation and take those risks and have hard conversations, we're going to actually do better by all of us. Thanks.
Chandra, I think that's a great nonpartisan response to look at, you know, dignity and people-centered, and that it requires collaboration and trust across the aisles. The UN Association is also non-political. We do not support any particular candidate. However, if the SDGs and the things, Bryson, that you and others are talking about are going to be met, it requires, as Chandra says, some commitment to act on those things. We have a limited amount of resources in the world. Decisions have got to be made all the time. Should there be a living wage? Should there be access to health care? Or 40 million people might not have access. Obviously, these things cost money. So that's why it gets back to who do we tax and who gets the benefit of taxes. It gets back to how do we support certain programs or not. There's you know, a few $1 trillion going right now into addressing the needs of people as a consequence of the coronavirus. So the money is there if we want to make it there. One other step is that if the SDGs will be met, it will be through countries, governments with a commitment, business with a commitment, NGOs with a commitment to address them. If we stand back and say, not enough money to go around, there's going to be a deficit, or we can't afford to give up the military, or we can't afford to give up subsidies for agriculture, or wherever the money's going, then people will not be dealt with. Finally, about 25, 30 years ago, the United Nations organizations, including the one I worked with, the UN Development Program, made a significant conceptual switch in their thinking. And that is that development was not because of gross national product or the number of industrial operations and smokestacks or balance of trade or those kind of things. It was about human development, and then it was merged into sustainable human development. Development has got to be for the people, supported by other people and by governments. And the decisions are in the hands of policymakers to focus on development for people, by people. So yeah, there are costs involved. There are certainly trade-offs. And we've got to decide, as I said at the outset, whether people are aware of the need to take action and then committed to do it ambitiously.
So we're nearing the end of our time for Q&A. I just wanted to say one last thing here. One is just one example that I happen to know about a local Marin-based policy improvement was I know that the city of Novato approved a higher minimum wage for people at this who work not just for the city itself, but actually businesses within the city's jurisdiction last year, and recently upheld that even amongst pushback related to COVID. So that would be one local initiative that relates directly to this topic. And also I just wanted to ask both Herb and Chandra, any specific action items, asks, volunteers, donations, whatever for your various organizations or initiatives? And with 1 minute before we transition.
Vote, make sure you're counted in the census, donate to Community Action Marin if you want to have local response in terms of advocacy and direct service action. Happy to have ongoing conversations with all of you, and thank you. Thanks, Felicia.
Echo that, and also you have a voice, and elected officials are accountable to you, the citizens of Marin, and to us in California. And if they don't hear from us saying that these things like combating poverty or education, whatever is important, they don't know, or they'll hear from people who have a very particular approach, and it will not necessarily be to support human dignity and human development, human potential. So in addition to voting, there's the other aspect of use your voice collectively with others if you can, or independently, or write a letter like John did.
Great. So certainly Herb and Chandra, you're welcome to stay with us to the 4:30 mark, and we're going to transition now back to Bryson.